There is an invisible architecture to human experience, a quiet geometry that governs the rising and falling of our personal epics. We often walk through our days assuming that growth is a linear ascent, a smooth and steady climbing of a sunlit mountain where each step yields a wider view and a lighter breath. Yet anyone who has ever undergone a profound transformation of the self knows that the universe does not operate on the logic of gentle gradients. Instead, the grandest shifts in consciousness, those tectonic realignments of how we perceive reality, meaning, and our own identity, are almost universally preceded by a period of intense, seemingly inexplicable friction. It is as if the fabric of existence tightens its grip around us, constricting our movements, amplifying our old wounds, and casting a shadow of profound difficulty over our daily lives, just as we stand on the precipice of a monumental awakening. This phenomenon is not a cruel twist of cosmic fate, nor is it a sign that we have wandered off our proper path. Rather, it is the unmistakable labor pains of a new way of being, a necessary and deliberate acceleration of pressure designed to break open the shells of who we used to be, so that we might finally inhabit who we are truly meant to become. To understand this sudden onset of hardship, we must look to the natural world, where the laws of transformation are written in every shifting season and evolving form. And consider the moment just before the dawn breaks across the horizon, when the darkness of the night seems to deepen into its most absolute, impenetrable ink. Consider the caterpillar inside the chrysalis, whose body must completely dissolve into an amorphous, chaotic soup before the blueprint of the butterfly can organize itself into wings. Consider also the immense physical forces required to forge a diamond beneath the crust of the earth, where carbon must endure centuries of crushing weight and scorching heat before its internal structure rearranges into a crystalline lattice capable of reflecting pure light. In every corner of creation, the transition from one state of matter to another requires a temporary breakdown of the existing order. Yet the old form must be pressured beyond its capacity to endure, forced into a state of structural crisis where it can no longer maintain its original shape. Human consciousness obeys this exact same law, and when our lives suddenly become intensely difficult, it is often because we have reached the absolute limit of our current container. When we find ourselves entangled in this pre-shift turbulence, the difficulties manifest across every dimension of our existence. Relationships that once felt stable and supportive suddenly begin to fray or feel suffocating, exposing hidden fractures that we can no longer ignore. Pursuits and professions that used to provide us with a sense of identity and purpose are abruptly drained of their color, leaving us with a hollow ache of dissatisfaction that no amount of material success can soothe. And even our inner landscape becomes a battlefield, as long-buried anxieties, forgotten griefs, and shadows we thought we had outgrown rise to the surface of our awareness with terrifying clarity. It feels as though the universe has turned its volume up to a deafening roar, forcing us to confront every unresolved dissonance within our souls. In our desperation, we often mistake this cosmic pressure for failure, convincing ourselves that we have done something wrong, that we are being punished, or that we are losing our grip on reality. But this judgment is merely the voice of the old ego, which clings desperately to the familiar shore and interprets the rising tide of change as an impending shipwreck. In truth, this gathering storm is an act of profound grace, a fierce and uncompromising love from the deeper intelligence that orchestrates our lives. The difficulty intensifies precisely because the universe is trying to make our old way of living completely uninhabitable. If the old patterns, the toxic dynamics, and the limiting beliefs remained comfortable, we would never find the courage to abandon them. We would linger indefinitely in the lukewarm waters of mediocrity, trading our infinite potential for the illusion of safety. Therefore, the architecture of reality introduces friction. It makes the old skin tight, itchy, and painful so that we are driven by sheer necessity to shed it. The hardships we face in these liminal moments are not roadblocks designed to stop our journey, but rather catalysts intended to burn away the illusions, attachments, and false identities that we have gathered along the way. They are the fires of an alchemical crucible, dismantling our superficial layers so that the essential truth of our being can finally emerge, unburdened by the weight of who we thought we were supposed to be. As we navigate this turbulent passage, we are being invited to develop an entirely new relationship with adversity. Instead of fighting the current or sinking into despondency, we must learn to recognize the hidden utility of our pain. Every obstacle that suddenly blocks our path, every emotional wave that threatens to submerge us, is a highly specific mirror reflecting the exact areas where our consciousness is still bound by fear, lack, and separation. The difficulty is not a random assault from an indifferent cosmos, but a tailored curriculum designed by our own deeper consciousness to facilitate our liberation. When we begin to view our struggles through this expansive lens, a profound shift occurs within us. We cease to be passive victims of circumstances and instead become active participants in a sacred initiation. We understand that the darkness we are experiencing is not the darkness of a tomb, but the darkness of a womb, a fertile, silent space where a grander, wiser, and more luminous version of ourselves is currently being gestated, waiting for the precise moment of its ultimate unveiling. This book of our lives is filled with chapters that must end before new ones can begin. Yet the space between those chapters is often characterized by a profound sense of emptiness and disorientation. It is a borderland where the old rules no longer apply, but the new laws have not yet been revealed. In this holy suspension, the mind panics, searching for anchors in a sea of fluid change, while the heart senses that something magnificent is preparing to dawn. To survive and thrive within this crucible, we must learn to trust the rhythm of the collapse. We must understand that when our lives get harder, it is a signal that our soul has grown too vast for its current environment, and the walls of our reality are fracturing simply because they can no longer contain the magnitude of our expanding light. It is an invitation to stand firm in the center of the storm, to breathe into the discomfort, and to recognize that the shattering of our world is actually the opening of the gateway to a higher, more aligned, and infinitely more conscious state of existence. To wander through the landscape of a collapsing reality without a map is to risk becoming swallowed by the despondency of the ego. Therefore, we must seek to understand the underlying pillars, the universal mechanics that govern this sacred friction right before the soul takes flight. The first foundational theme we encounter in this mystery is the law of vibrational incompatibility. Every state of consciousness possesses its own distinct resonant frequency, a unique energetic signature that dictates what kind of experiences, relationships, and environments can exist within its field. When an individual begins to internalize a higher truth, when they cultivate deeper compassion, greater authenticity, and a commitment to spiritual sovereignty, their internal frequency begins to rise. However, the external structures of their life, built upon the foundations of their older, more fearful self, remain anchored in the previous frequency. This disparity creates an immediate and violent dissonance. It is a metaphysical law that two opposing frequencies cannot permanently occupy the same space without causing a disruption. The sudden hardship we experience is the structural rattling of this energetic mismatch, as the old life resists the destabilizing influence of the incoming light. This structural rattling directly exposes the profound illusion of comfort that most human beings mistake for peace. For decades, we may live within a construct of reality that is highly predictable but deeply misaligned with our soul's true purpose. We accept numbing routines, transactional relationships, and compromised dreams because they offer a semblance of safety. This is the kingdom of the false self, a fortress built of coping mechanisms and societal expectations. When the consciousness shift begins, the deeper intelligence within us launches a silent assault upon this very fortress. The things that once provided comfort suddenly begin to irritate. The distractions that used to successfully dull our existential ache lose their potency entirely. This occurs because true growth requires the total dismantling of our false sanctuaries. The universe strips away our crutches not out of malice, but to reveal that we already possess the strength to walk unaided. The discomfort is an intentional wake-up call designed to break the hypnotic spell of complacency and force us to look beyond the superficial horizons of our material security. As the old walls crumble, we are brought face to face with another core concept of the transformational process: the excavation of the shadow self. In the ordinary course of life, we excel at compartmentalizing our pain, tucking our unresolved traumas, unexpressed angers, and deep-seated unworthiness into the dark basements of our subconscious. We build elaborate personalities designed to keep these shadows out of sight, projecting an image of wholeness to the world while bleeding silently within. But a higher state of consciousness cannot be built upon a foundation of suppression. A shift in awareness is, by definition, an expansion of light, and when light expands, it inevitably illuminates the darkest corners of the house. The intense emotional and psychological difficulty that precedes a shift is often the sudden, overwhelming emergence of these buried aspects of ourselves. It feels as though we are regressing, as old addictions, childish reactivities, and irrational fears storm the gates of our awareness. In reality, this is not a regression, but a purification. The shadow is rising not to defeat us, but to be seen, acknowledged, integrated, and finally released into the clearing warmth of our awakened presence. This process of purification demands that we surrender our attachment to control, which introduces the theme of the egoic death rattle. The ego, that localized construct of identity that thrives on separation, definition, and predictability, views any shift toward a higher consciousness as an existential threat. It knows that in the realm of greater awareness, its absolute dictatorship will be overthrown by the wisdom of the heart. Consequently, when the ego senses that a profound shift is imminent, it panics. It activates every defense mechanism at its disposal, amplifying its narratives of victimhood, scarcity, and doom. The chaos in our external lives is often mirrored and magnified by this internal desperation of the ego, which fights with a cornered animal's ferocity to maintain its grip on our reality. The hardships become a stage where the ego performs its final, most dramatic tragedies, trying to convince us that if we let go of our old grievances, our old titles, and our old ways of defending ourselves, we will cease to exist entirely. Learning to recognize this uproar as a mere death rattle is crucial, for it allows us to witness the storm without believing that we are the storm itself. Interwoven with this internal battlefield is the concept of the dissolution of karmic loops. And throughout our lives, we unconsciously repeat cycles of behavior, drawing the same archetypal conflicts and characters into our reality over and over again. These loops are the universe's way of presenting us with the same lesson until we choose a different response. Right before a significant shift in consciousness, these karmic loops tend to compress and intensify, presenting themselves with unprecedented speed and gravity. It can feel as though a lifetime's worth of challenges is being packed into a single month, a single week, or even a single day. This compression is a divine efficiency. The universe is giving us a final exam, crowding our stage with our ultimate triggers to see if we will choose the old path of fear, defense, and judgment, or if we will finally step into the new path of forgiveness, awareness, and grace. And the sheer weight of this compression is exhausting, but it serves to burn through centuries of accumulated inertia, forcing a rapid evolution that would otherwise take lifetimes to achieve. Ultimately, these core themes converge upon a singular truth: the necessity of total surrender. The difficulty of the transition is directly proportional to our resistance to it. We suffer not because the universe is breaking our world apart, but because we are trying to hold the broken pieces together with our bare, bleeding hands. We mistake our frantic efforts at preservation for strength, failing to see that the highest form of strength in a moment of cosmic realignment is the willingness to let go. Surrender is not a passive defeatism. It is the active, conscious alignment of our individual will with the greater evolutionary current of existence. It is the realization that the old life is leaving because it has served its purpose, and that something infinitely more beautiful is waiting to take its place. When we cease our frantic rowing against the waterfall of change and allow ourselves to be carried by the stream, the hardship loses its agonizing edge. We begin to see the hidden order within the chaos, realizing that every breakdown is merely a breakthrough in disguise, and that the shattering of our world is the very mechanism by which we are being set free. To comprehend the profound alchemy of this pre-shift tribulation, human reason alone is often insufficient, for the mind speaks in logic, while the soul communicates in the timeless language of myth, symbol, and allegory. Let us step into the ancient laboratory of the spirit, where the masters of old sought to transform base metals into incorruptible gold. They understood that the physical universe was merely a mirror for the interior architecture of the soul. In their sacred art, the very first stage of the great work was known as the nigredo, or the blackening. In this phase, the raw material of the self was cast into a sealed crucible and subjected to a fierce, unrelenting fire. The matter would turn pitch black, foul-smelling, and seemingly ruined, dissolving into a state of total putrefaction. As to an untrained onlooker, the experiment would appear to be a catastrophic failure, an irreversible tragedy of destruction. Yet the alchemist knew that this total blackening was the most critical juncture of the entire process. Without the nigredo, the dense, stubborn bonds of the base material could never be broken. The darkness was not an end, but the necessary dissolution of the old identity, a holy scattering of components so that the impurities could float to the top and be skimmed away, leaving behind the pristine essence ready to receive the silver and gold of illumination. A similar narrative of necessary devastation is echoed in the ancient mythologies of the world, nowhere more potently than in the story of Inanna, the Sumerian queen of heaven, who chose to descend into the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, the goddess of the dark abyss. Inanna was a deity of immense power, radiant beauty, and royal privilege, adorned with the 7 divine decrees, wearing her crown of stars and her robes of sovereignty. Yet, as she approached the first of the 7 gates of the underworld, she was stopped by the gatekeeper, who informed her that according to the ancient laws of the deep, she could not enter as she was. At each of the 7 gates, Inanna was forced to strip away a piece of her royal attire. At one gate, she surrendered her crown, at another her scepter, at another her jewels, and finally, at the 7th gate, her very clothing. She entered the throne room of her dark sister completely naked, stripped of every title, every defense, and every symbol of her worldly identity. There, in the depths of the underworld, she was struck dead and hung from a meat hook on the wall, rotting in the absolute dark. This mythological death is the exact psychic mirror of the profound difficulty that visits us before a consciousness shift. We are stripped of our crowns, our worldly pride, our scepters, our illusions of control, and our robes, the false personalities we wear to protect ourselves from the world. We feel exposed, raw, and utterly destroyed, hanging in a state of suspended animation, where our old life is completely dead, but our new life has not yet been born. Yet, as the myth reveals, this state of total powerlessness is the very catalyst for divine intervention. Inanna's father sends quiet, inconspicuous entities made of the dirt beneath his fingernails to slip into the underworld unnoticed, bearing the water of life and the food of life. They empathize with the suffering of the Dark Queen of the Abyss, and through that profound acknowledgement, Inanna is resurrected. When she ascends back through the 7 gates, she receives her garments, her jewels, and her crown back. But they are no longer just external ornaments. They are now infused with the indestructible wisdom of the underworld. She returns to her heavenly realm not just as a queen of light, but as a fully integrated being who has conquered the shadow and united the upper and lower worlds. We see the same cosmic principle illustrated in the epic poetry of the natural world, specifically in the majestic architecture of the eagle's midlife transformation. When an eagle reaches approximately 40 years of age, its body begins to betray its royal status. Its long, flexible talons can no longer seize the prey that sustains its life. Its sharp beak becomes bent and blunt, curving back toward its chest, and its wings grow heavy with aged, thick feathers, sticking to its breast and making flight an agonizing, clumsy struggle. At this crossroads, the eagle is left with only 2 choices: to accept its slow starvation and die, or to undergo a profoundly painful process of renewal that lasts for many long months. To choose life, the eagle must fly to a lonely mountain peak and nest on a high, jagged rock face where it is completely isolated from the world. There, the eagle begins its brutal labor. It strikes its blunt beak against the stone with furious, repetitive blows until the old beak is completely torn from its face. It waits in the cold, bleeding, and defenseless for a new beak to slowly grow in. Once the new beak emerges, the eagle uses it to pluck out its old, withered talons one by one. And when the new talons harden, the magnificent bird begins to pull out its heavy, suffocating feathers, baring its skin to the elements. Only after 5 months of this self-inflicted crucifixion does the eagle take its legendary flight of rebirth, soaring into the heavens with renewed vision, strength, and an extended lease on life for another 30 years. The eagle's rock is the silent space of our own spiritual isolation. The breaking of the beak is the shattering of our voice, our outdated expressions, and the way we used to consume and interpret reality. The plucking of the talons is the forced surrender of our ability to grasp, hold on to, and control our relationships and material circumstances. The tearing away of the feathers is the shedding of our old protective armor, leaving us completely naked to the winds of change. This period of isolation and raw vulnerability feels like a prolonged torture, a state of utter abandonment where we have lost our majesty and our power to fly. Yet, it is precisely within this sanctuary of suffering that the structural blueprint of our higher self is quietly regenerating. The pain is not a sign of degeneration, but the heavy price of a magnificent renewal, an indispensable investment in a future where we will ride the thermals of existence with an unprecedented freedom and an unclouded vision that spans across the vastness of the horizon. These symbolic narratives remind us that the collapse of our personal world is a sacred, orchestrated descent. Whether it is the Negredo of the alchemist, the underworld journey of Inanna, or the solitary mountain crucible of the eagle, the message written across the stars of human consciousness remains identical. The old form must be thoroughly undone before the higher intelligence can manifest its next masterpiece. When your life becomes unendurably hard, you are not being abandoned by the divine. You are being initiated. You are being held in the crucible, stripped at the gates, and broken against the stone, not to destroy you, but to ensure that when you finally rise, you do so with a purity, a strength, and a majesty that can never be taken away from you by the fleeting illusions of the world. When the lofty heights of cosmic metaphor and ancient mythology collide with the stark, unyielding concrete of daily life, we are faced with the true challenge of the spiritual path, the necessity of practical integration. It is one thing to appreciate the alchemical beauty of the dark night of the soul while reading a text in a moment of quiet contemplation. It is an entirely different matter to navigate that same darkness when your bank account is dwindling, your primary relationship is dissolving, or a sudden wave of existential dread paralyzes you in the middle of a mundane workday. To bridge the gap between grand metaphysical shifts and real-world implications, we must develop a grounded, tactical approach to our suffering. The first step in this practical integration is the radical cessation of all spiritual bypassing, and we must resist the temptation to overlay superficial, positive thinking or spiritual platitudes onto our genuine pain. When a structure in your life breaks down, it is meant to hurt. Feeling the full weight of that sorrow, anger, or confusion is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the very mechanism by which the emotional body processes and clears the dense energy of the old paradigm. To practice this integration in real time, one must master the art of non-reactive observation, shifting from the frantic role of the character trapped within the burning house to the calm perspective of the witness watching the fire from a safe distance. When a crisis erupts in your external reality, whether it is a sudden conflict with a colleague or the unexpected termination of a long-standing project, your immediate instinctual response will be to fix, control, or defend. And this is the old egoic program operating on autopilot, attempting to force the chaotic pieces of your world back into their familiar, compromised shapes. Integration requires you to intentionally pause in that exact moment of high tension, to take a deep, grounding breath, and to ask yourself a fundamentally different question. What part of my old identity is this situation trying to kill? By shifting your inquiry from a victimized complaint about your circumstances to a curious investigation into your own evolution, you instantly disarm the frantic grip of fear and align yourself with the underlying current of the shift. This practice extends directly into how we manage our physical and emotional energy during these high-pressure transitions, and because a consciousness shift represents a massive upgrade to your internal energetic circuitry, the physical body often bears the brunt of the acceleration, experiencing profound fatigue, unexplainable sleep disruptions, or a sudden, hypersensitive reaction to certain environments and foods. Practically speaking, this means you must honor the biological demands of your transformation. When your life gets harder right before a shift, it is an unambiguous signal from your soul to slow down, simplify your external commitments, and fiercely protect your personal boundaries. It is a time to treat yourself with the radical gentleness one would offer to a patient recovering from a major surgical procedure. You are, in a very real sense, undergoing a profound psychic surgery and demanding that you maintain your usual levels of hyperproductivity, social performance, and relentless ambition during this vulnerable window is not only counterproductive, but it also actively resists the necessary breakdown of the old, unsustainable way of operating. Furthermore, integrating these insights requires a profound reevaluation of your relationship with time and progress. In the modern world, we are conditioned to view any pause, delay, or apparent regression as an unmitigated disaster, equating constant forward momentum with personal worth. But the rhythm of a consciousness shift demands that we embrace the high utility of the plateau and the necessary retreat of the ebb tide. There will be phases within this transition where absolutely nothing seems to be happening on the surface, where your old life has completely ended, but the new doors refuse to open, leaving you stranded in a seemingly infinite expanse of emptiness. Instead of filling this void with frantic, misaligned actions born of panic, you must learn to sit within the stillness, understanding that the roots of a great tree grow deepest in the silent dark of winter. Long before the first green, shoots break through the frozen soil. This capacity to tolerate the unknown without forcing a premature conclusion is perhaps the ultimate hallmark of a mature, integrated awareness. On an interpersonal level, this integration will inevitably manifest as a quiet, natural realignment of your social circle. As your internal frequency shifts, you will find that certain conversations, dynamics, and environments that you once tolerated or even enjoyed now feel incredibly draining or disharmonious. You do not need to stage dramatic confrontations or cast judgment upon those who no longer resonate with your expanding awareness. Instead, you simply allow the natural law of energetic subtraction to take its course. You bless the relationships that have served their purpose, honoring them for the lessons they provided, and you gracefully step back, creating the necessary vacuum within your life that allows new, more aligned companions to eventually appear. And this process requires an immense amount of courage, as it often involves walking through a temporary wilderness of deep loneliness before the new tribe reveals itself. But it is an indispensable step in anchoring your new state of consciousness into a supportive social reality. Ultimately, the real-world implication of understanding this phenomenon is that it completely changes your definition of good luck and bad luck. When you realize that the universe uses difficulty as a precise diagnostic tool to highlight where you are still bound by illusion, you stop praying for an easy life and start praying for an awake life. You begin to greet your challenges not as malicious invasions from an indifferent world, but as highly customized, sacred opportunities for your own liberation. You face the storm with a straight spine and an open heart, confident in the knowledge that every disruption to your comfort is a direct invitation to step into your sovereignty, and that the very obstacles that threaten to break you are, in truth, the stepping stones upon which you will ascend to a grander, wiser, and infinitely more beautiful manifestation of your destiny. We stand at last on the high ridge of our contemplation, looking back across the winding, precipitous path that has led us through the alchemical fires, the underworld gates, the solitary mountain peaks, and the grounded realities of our everyday lives. What we have unraveled here is nothing less than the hidden masterpiece of human evolution, the profound realization that the moments of our deepest fracturing are the very coordinates where our greatest expansion begins. We have seen that when life becomes unendurably difficult, when our structures collapse, our relationships fray, and our internal landscapes are engulfed by the rising tides of long-buried shadows, it is never a verdict of failure. It is, instead, the ultimate proof of our readiness. It is the universe paying us the highest compliment a soul can receive. The acknowledgement that we have grown too vast for the small, safe worlds we built for ourselves, and that we possess the necessary strength to endure the crushing pressures required to birth a higher state of consciousness. This understanding demands a total and permanent revolution in how we meet our destiny. We can no longer afford the luxury of playing the victim to our circumstances, nor can we waste our precious life energy weeping over the broken pieces of a past that was ultimately too small to contain our light. The old world is leaving because it must. It has served its sacred purpose as a training ground, and any frantic attempt to resuscitate its dying forms is merely an act of violence against our own evolutionary trajectory. The pain we feel is the friction of our own resistance, the ache of our fingers tightly gripping the edge of a cliff when our wings are already fully formed and begging for the open sky. To step into the truth of who we are, we must willingly let go of the cliff. We must trust the rhythm of the collapse, leaning completely into the holy emptiness of the transition, with the absolute certainty that the deeper intelligence orchestrating our lives does not build voids without intending to fill them with a grander splendor. Therefore, this final message is not a gentle lullaby to soothe your fears, but a fierce, transformational battle cry for your soul. If you currently find yourself in the thick of the pre-shift storm, if you are exhausted by the relentless compression, blinded by the darkness of your personal negredo, or feeling stripped bare at the gates of your own underworld, hear this truth with every fiber of your being. Do not yield. Do not shrink back into the counterfeit comfort of your old illusions, and do not compromise your awakening for the sake of a fleeting, superficial peace. Stand perfectly still in the very center of the crucible. Breathe deeply into the raw, aching vulnerability of your unmaking, and allow the fires to do their holy work. Let them burn away every false identity you wore as armor, every toxic dynamic you accepted out of fear of loneliness, and every limiting belief that told you that you were anything less than an incarnate spark of the infinite divine. And the world you are leaving behind was built on the fragile foundations of separation, control, and fear. The world you are stepping into is anchored in the indestructible bedrock of unity, sovereignty, and unconditional love. The transition between these two kingdoms is a narrow, terrifying bridge that must be crossed on foot in total isolation and with no guarantee of safety other than the intuitive whisper of your own heart. But you do not walk this bridge alone. You are accompanied by the silent, cheering presence of every awakened soul that has ever braved the darkness before you, and you are guided by the infallible compass of your own higher consciousness, which has already mapped out every twist and turn of this sacred initiation. The darkness is not your tomb, it is your womb. And the shattering of your world is not an ending. It is the magnificent, chaotic, and necessary overture to your ultimate rebirth. Let us then step forward into the unknown with a straight spine, an open heart, and an unshakable trust in the cosmic architecture of our lives. When the pressure intensifies, welcome it as the forge of your divinity. When the old structures crumble, bless them for their service and watch them fall without regret. You are a diamond in the making, an eagle regenerating on the rock, a sovereign creator being prepared to wield an unprecedented magnitude of light. Claim your power, inhabit your truth, and allow the old self to dissolve entirely into the clearing wind so that the magnificent awakened being you came here to be can finally stand up, cast aside the shroud of the past, and take its rightful place in the glorious, unfolding dawn of a new earth.